I signed off on that building because it passed every safety rule I was sworn to enforce. On paper, it was clean. On the site, it looked normal. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 2:17 a.m. A woman whispered my name, then hung up. The next morning, I found a fire exit bolted shut from the inside. No alarms went off. No reports were filed. That's when I realized everything I believed about doing my job right was about to collapse. I had been doing this job long enough to trust routine more than instinct. Every weekday morning, I left my house at 6:30 a.m. sharp. Same thermos. Same faded navy windbreaker with the Arizona State safety patch on the shoulder. Same drive east on Loop 202, watching the desert sky shift from black to washed-out orange as the sun came up over the superstitions. Phoenix looked calm at that hour. Honest, like a place where things stayed where you put them. That belief had carried me through 26 years as a state building safety inspector. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a crusader. I was a guy who followed the code, filled out the forms, and shut down sites when something didn't meet the book. That was the deal I made with myself after the divorce, after my daughter left for college, after my life shrank down to work, sleep, and a quiet house in Tempe with gravel instead of grass. If I did my job right, people stayed alive. If I cut corners, someone else paid the price. That was the moral math I lived by. On the morning everything started, I was reviewing inspection schedules at my kitchen counter, toast burning in the toaster behind me. The radio was on low, a traffic report repeating the same accidents on I-10. Nothing urgent, nothing personal. The file at the top of my stack was labeled Sunridge Haven, Pays I. Luxury Assisted Living, North Phoenix, Private Funding. I remembered the name because it had been fast-tracked through approvals. Too fast. The plans were thick, professionally prepared, stamped by engineers with reputations I recognized. Fire suppression, emergency exits, backup power. Everything in order. That alone should have made me suspicious. Projects that clean usually meant someone had paid a lot of money to make them that way. But suspicion isn't evidence, and evidence is the only thing that matters when your signature can shut down a multi-million-dollar site. I took a bite of toast, tasted smoke, and scraped it into the sink. By 8:15 a.m., I was walking the Sunridge site with the developer himself. Mark Ellison looked exactly like the kind of man who built places for other people to grow old in. Early 60s. Athletic in a careful way, white hair that hadn't given up yet. His boots were clean enough to tell me he didn't wear them often. "Appreciate you coming out personally, Daniel," he said, offering a firm handshake. "We like to stay ahead of things." People who say that usually don't. The building was still a skeleton. Steel framing, concrete floors, temporary plywood walkways. The desert wind cut through the structure, carrying dust and the smell of cut metal. Crews moved efficiently, hard hats low, radios clipped to belts. Nothing felt wrong. That was the problem. I walked the perimeter, clipboard tucked under my arm, eyes trained to look for the kinds of mistakes that happen when deadlines matter more than safety. Missing fire stops, improper spacing, unlabeled shutoffs. Everything was where it should be. At one point, a younger engineer named Kyle Thin, nervous energy, hovered near us while I checked a stairwell. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again. When our eyes met, he looked away too quickly. I made a note of his name. Not because I knew what it meant yet, just because I'd learned to write things down when my instincts twitched. By noon, the inspection was done. "Clean," I said, tapping the clipboard. "Pending final systems testing." Ellison smiled, relief flashing just a little too fast across his face. "That's good to hear. We're housing our first residents in 6 months." Residents, not tenants, not clients. I drove away feeling the quiet satisfaction that comes from a job completed properly. No drama, no confrontation, just the steady hum of doing what you're supposed to do. That afternoon, my supervisor called me into his office. He didn't close the door. "Sunridge Haven," he said, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Good work out there." "Thanks," I said. He nodded once. "Just so you know, that project's got some eyes on it, politically." There it was, the word that meant pressure without saying it. "Understood," I replied. because that was my job too. To understand without agreeing to anything. He smiled, relieved. Appreciate your flexibility. I went home early that day. The house was quiet in the way it always was. No photos on the walls except one of my daughter at 15, squinting into the sun at Lake Pleasant. I reheated leftover chili and ate it standing at the counter, watching the sky fade purple through the kitchen window. At 9:30 p.m., I locked the doors and went to bed. At 2017 a.m., my phone rang. I woke up already tense, heart jumping before my brain caught up. Nobody calls at that hour unless something is wrong. I fumbled the phone off the nightstand, knocking over a paperback I'd been pretending to read for 3 weeks. Unknown number. Hello? My voice sounded thick, half asleep. For a second, there was only breathing, slow, shallow. Then a woman spoke. "Mr. Brooks," she said. She pronounced it carefully, like she didn't want to get it wrong. "Yes," I answered, sitting up. "Who is this?" "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't have much time." Her voice wasn't panicked. That was what unsettled me. It was tired, controlled. "Ma'am, if this is about a building, you signed the papers today," she said. "For the place on Desert Crest Road." That woke me all the way up. "Who are you?" I asked again. She inhaled, like she was gathering courage. "You were fair. That's why I'm calling you." In the background, I heard something metallic. A distant clang, like a door closing. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time after that. No follow-up call, no voicemail, no text. At 2:46 a.m., I finally lay back down, telling myself it was nothing. A prank. A confused resident. Someone who had gotten my name off a public record and decided to scare a state employee in the middle of the night. By morning, that explanation felt thinner. I arrived at the office before sunrise, coffee untouched on my desk. I pulled the Sunridge file back out, flipping through the pages like they might have changed overnight. They hadn't. But when I drove past the site later that day just to clear my head, I noticed something small, easy to miss. One of the temporary fire exits on the east side was blocked. Not by debris, not by accident. A steel bar had been bolted across the door from the inside. No signage, no explanation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't illegal yet. Temporary structures didn't fall under final code enforcement. But I stood there longer than I needed to, fingers resting on the cool metal, feeling a weight settle in my chest that had nothing to do with policy. No alarms were sounding. No complaints had been filed. No reports mentioned a late-night phone call. I drove away knowing one thing with a certainty that made my stomach tighten. The system, I trusted the rules, the paperwork, the clean inspections, had just shown me its blind spot. And whatever lived in that space between what was legal and what was right was already awake, already moving, and already aware of my name. I told myself not to overthink the fire exit. That was the easiest lie to reach for. Inspectors live on technicalities, temporary structures, construction phases, pending systems. There was always a clause you could lean on if you wanted to sleep at night. Still, I logged the observation. Not as a violation, just a note. East side temporary exit reinforced with interior bar, monitor. I stared at the sentence longer than necessary, then saved the file and closed it. The screen went dark, reflecting my face back at me. 52 years old, lines settling in places I didn't remember earning. A man who believed problems could be managed if you named them clearly enough. The rest of that week passed without incident. No more calls, no emails, no anonymous tips. Sunridge Haven stayed quiet, almost aggressively so. Mark Ellison didn't reach out. My supervisor didn't follow up. The blocked exit remained blocked, then quietly wasn't, like it had never existed at all. By Friday afternoon, I was close to convincing myself I'd imagined the whole thing. That's when I got invited to lunch. Ellison's assistant called just after noon. Polite, efficient. She said Mark wanted to thank me personally and discuss long-term cooperation. The restaurant he chose sat just off Scottsdale Road, all glass and light wood, the kind of place where the servers remembered your name if you came often enough. I arrived early and took a seat where I could see the parking lot. Ellison showed up exactly on time. He wasn't wearing boots this time. Gray slacks, open collar shirt, no tie. He smiled like a man used to controlling the temperature of a room. "Daniel," he said warmly, "I'm glad you could make it." "Of course," I replied. We ordered. He talked about the heat, the market, how Phoenix kept growing despite everyone predicting it would dry up and blow away. Safe topics, neutral ground. Only after our plates arrived did he steer the conversation where he wanted it. "You've got a reputation," he said, cutting into his salmon. "Straight shooter. No surprises." "I try to keep things predictable," I said. He nodded. "That's valuable, especially on projects like Sunridge. People get nervous when they don't understand the process." "What people?" I asked. Ellison smiled again. "Investors, families, future residents. No one wants to hear the word inspection and imagine delays." I took a sip of water. "Inspections prevent worse delays later." "Exactly," he said quickly. "That's why we respect what you do." There it was. Respect. The word people use when they want something but don't want to sound like they're asking. He leaned back slightly, lowering his voice. "Sunridge is meant to be a place of dignity. We're offering options most of these folks don't have." I didn't respond. Ellison studied my face, recalibrating. "I know the code can feel rigid, but sometimes flexibility is the humane choice." That word again. Humane. I set my fork down. "If you have a concern about compliance, you should raise it through official channels." He held up his hands. "Of course. I'm just saying when the time comes, we'd appreciate clarity. No surprises." Lunch ended shortly after that. No bribes, no threats, nothing I could point to and say, "This is where it crossed the line." And yet, as I walked back to my car, I felt like I'd just been weighed and measured in a way that had nothing to do with my job description. The following Monday, I received a new assignment. Routine warehouse inspection. South Tempe. Nothing controversial. Sunridge Haven disappeared from my schedule. I didn't like that. I asked my supervisor about it casually, like it didn't matter. He shrugged and said workload adjustments happened all the time. "You've been carrying a heavy caseload," he added. "Take the breather." I nodded, took the file, did the inspection, filed the report. At home that night, I poured a bourbon I didn't need and sat on the back patio, listening to the low hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The desert cooled quickly after sunset, heat bleeding off the concrete like a held breath finally released. I thought about the woman's voice on the phone. "You were fair." Fair wasn't a word people used often when they were satisfied. Fair implied comparison, choice, winners and losers. On Tuesday, my daughter called. That alone was enough to tighten my chest. She was busy, grad school, a life that didn't leave much room for casual check-ins. "Hey, Dad," she said. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Why?" She hesitated. "I got a weird message on LinkedIn. Someone asking about you." My grip tightened on the phone. "Asking what?" "Just what kind of person you are. If you ever talk about work at home. Stuff like that." "Did you respond?" "No." It felt off. I thanked her, told her to ignore it, told her it was probably nothing. After we hung up, I sat very still. By Wednesday, I was done pretending nothing was happening. I drove back to Sunridge Haven unannounced. The site looked the same. Efficient, clean, almost serene in the early morning light. Workers moved with practiced rhythm, metal clanging softly, forklifts beeping in measured intervals. I walked past the front office without checking in. No one stopped me. The east side fire exit, the one I'd touched days earlier, was unblocked now. Fresh paint covered the bolt holes. Someone had been careful, thorough. Inside the structure, the air felt cooler than it should have. I followed the sound of voices down a temporary corridor and found a group of older adults seated in folding chairs, listening to a woman with a clipboard explain amenities. They didn't look like people touring luxury housing. They looked tired. A woman with silver hair caught my eye. Her gaze lingered on my badge longer than polite curiosity would justify. When the group dispersed, she approached me slowly. "Are you with the city?" she asked. "State," I corrected. She nodded once, like that mattered. "Can I talk to you?" I glanced around. No Ellison. No supervisors, just drywall and dust. My name is Helen, she said quietly. You inspected this place. Yes. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. We were told you're thorough. I waited. They say we can't move in unless everything passes, she continued. But they also say if it doesn't, we'll lose our deposits. Some of us sold our homes already. A cold understanding settled in my gut. What were you told about safety? I asked. Helen smiled sadly. That nothing is guaranteed, that at our age, risk is part of life. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document. The edges were worn soft. I didn't need to read it to know what it was. A waiver, not illegal, not uncommon, carefully worded to protect the developer while offering the illusion of choice. You called me, I said. Her eyes widened, just a fraction. I wasn't sure you'd come. Why me? Because you don't look away when things are inconvenient, she replied simply. I took the document, folded it back the way she'd had it, and handed it to her. I can't promise anything, I said. I know, Helen replied. But I needed someone to see us. As I walked back to my car, I understood something that made my chest ache. Sunridge Haven wasn't just a building. It was a solution to a problem no one wanted to solve, honestly. And whether I liked it or not, I had already stepped into the space between what the law allowed and what people needed to survive. I didn't file a report after that visit. That choice sat heavy in my chest the entire drive home, like a tool left behind inside a wall. Inspectors are trained to document everything. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And yet, the moment I imagined putting Helen's face into a formal memo reducing her to prospective resident, expressed concerns, something in me resisted. Instead, I did what I'd always done when a site felt wrong but clean on paper. I went looking for patterns. The next morning, I arrived at the office before anyone else. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I pulled permit records, inspection timelines, subcontractor lists. Sunridge Haven had been approved faster than comparable projects. Not illegally fast, just smoother, fewer revisions, fewer delays. I cross-checked material orders against the submitted plans. That's where the first crack appeared. The fire-resistant drywall specified in the design didn't match the invoice numbers logged by the supplier. Same thickness, same appearance, different rating. A downgrade that saved money and shaved days off delivery times. Not a smoking gun, a technicality. I flagged it internally and requested clarification from the engineering firm. 2 hours later, the response came back. Material substitution approved under provisional guidelines. See attached. The attachment was a scanned approval form bearing a signature I recognized. Not mine, not my supervisor's. Someone higher up, someone I didn't have easy access to. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny cracks in the paint. 1, 2, 3. Every system has pressure points, places where rules soften under weight. That afternoon, I ran into Kyle, the young engineer, by accident. He was standing outside the office building, smoking despite the no smoking sign bolted to the brick. When he saw me, he froze like a teenager, caught skipping class. Daniel, he said, too quickly. Hey, I replied. Got a minute? He glanced at the cigarette in his hand, crushed it under his boot, and nodded. We walked a few steps away from the entrance, far enough that passing coworkers wouldn't overhear. You looked like you wanted to say something last time, I said. Kyle swallowed. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't press. Silence does the work if you let it. After a moment, he exhaled sharply. Look, I just design what I'm told to design. Designs can be adjusted, I said. Safeguards can be restored. He shook his head. Not on that project. Why? He hesitated, then spoke so softly I almost missed it. Because every time someone asks questions, they're reassigned. The word landed between us, heavy and final. I didn't say anything, he added quickly. And you didn't hear it. I nodded. Understood. That night, my phone buzzed with an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line. Inside was a single sentence and a photo attachment. They tested the alarms after midnight. The photo showed a dark corridor, emergency lights glowing faint red, A digital timestamp in the corner read 12:43 a.m. Someone had circled a control panel with a thick red marker. The panel door hung open, wires exposed. I zoomed in, heart pounding. The panel belonged to Sunridge Haven. I deleted the email from my inbox, then from the trash, then powered my phone off entirely and sat in the dark of my living room, listening to the refrigerator hum. My mind replayed the woman's calm whisper, the blocked exit, the downgraded materials. None of it was illegal on its own. Together, it felt deliberate. Over the next few days, small things kept happening. A city fire marshal I'd known for years canceled a scheduled walkthrough at Sunridge without explanation. A zoning complaint filed by a neighboring business vanished from the system. My request for updated system tests went unanswered. Every thread I tugged slipped free in my hands. By Friday, I started noticing a car behind me on my commute. Dark sedan, no plates I could read. It stayed 2 car lengths back, peeled off before my exit, reappeared the next morning. Coincidence, I told myself. Then my supervisor called me into his office again. This time, the door was closed. "You've been digging," he said flatly. "I've been doing my job," I replied. He rubbed his temples. "Daniel, you need to understand how this looks. How it looks. Like you're making trouble where there isn't any." I leaned forward. "There are material substitutions that weren't disclosed. System tests happening off hours. Waivers signed under pressure." "Well," his eyes flicked to the door, then back to me. "None of that violates code. Not yet." He sighed. "You're not wrong, but you're not right in a way that helps anyone." That sentence chilled me more than any threat could have. When I left his office, I knew something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't just investigating a building anymore. I was testing the boundaries of how far integrity could stretch before it snapped. That weekend, I drove north without telling anyone. Sunridge Haven sat quiet under the moonlight. Construction paused, machinery still. I parked across the street and waited, windows cracked, engine off. At 12:39 a.m., a white utility van pulled in. 2 men got out, no uniforms, no logos. They unlocked a side entrance and disappeared inside. At 12:52, emergency lights flickered on, then off. No sirens, no calls. I took photos through my windshield, hands steady despite the adrenaline roaring in my ears. Documentation, evidence, the language I knew. As I drove away, my phone buzzed again. "Unknown number." "This time," I answered. "You shouldn't be here." A man's voice said calmly. "I'm on a public street," I replied. A pause. Then, "This doesn't have to become personal." I laughed softly, surprised by the sound. "It already is." The line went dead. On Sunday morning, I woke to find a note taped to my front door. No envelope, no handwriting, just printed text. "Protect your family." I stood there in my socks, desert air cool against my skin, staring at the words until they blurred. My daughter's face flashed through my mind, her cautious voice. The LinkedIn message? I peeled the note off the door, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my pocket. Up until that moment, I'd believed this was about regulations, corners cut, people too tired to fight back. Standing in my driveway, the sun rising over a quiet suburban street, I finally admitted the truth. Someone had decided I was an obstacle. And obstacles, I knew from years in this system, were either moved or removed. I didn't tell anyone about the note. Not my supervisor. Not the police. Not my daughter. There's a moment when you realize a situation has teeth, where involving other people feels less like protection and more like surrender. Once you speak it out loud, it stops being yours to manage. It becomes a process, a file, a waiting room with bad coffee and worse outcomes. I wasn't ready for that. So I did what I'd been trained to do for most of my adult life. I isolated the variables. On Monday morning, I returned to the office early and pulled every after-hours access log for Sunridge Haven. Badge swipes, temporary credentials, maintenance codes. The system showed activity, but nothing that violated policy. Entries labeled system testing, authorized personnel, approved windows, clean again, too clean. At 9:07 a.m., An internal calendar invite popped up on my screen. Sunridge Haven, resident orientation, private. Location, on-site conference suite. Time, 11 a.m. I hadn't been invited. That bothered me more than it should have. Orientation events usually involved sales staff, nurses, family members. Inspectors weren't required unless there was a formal handover. This wasn't that. The word private sat there like a warning label. I stared at the invite for a long time, then grabbed my jacket. If someone was about to show those residents something, I wanted to see what it was. The conference suite sat in a finished wing of the building, far cleaner than the rest of the site. Carpet installed, walls painted, artificial plants arranged to soften the edges, the kind of space designed to reassure. About 30 people sat in rows of padded chairs, mostly elderly, some with walkers, some with oxygen tanks quietly hissing beside them. A few younger faces, adult children, probably stood along the back wall. Helen spotted me as I slipped inside. Her eyes widened, then softened with something like relief. At the front of the room, Mark Ellison stood beside a large screen, smiling like a man about to deliver good news. A woman in scrubs hovered nearby, tablet in hand. "Thank you all for coming," Ellison said. "We know transitions can be stressful, so today is about transparency." The word landed wrong. He clicked a remote. A slide appeared showing floor plans, safety features highlighted in calming blue. He spoke smoothly about redundancy, monitoring, on-site staff, about dignity, about independence. I watched the residents' faces. Some nodded, some stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused. One man in the second row clutched the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Then Ellison's tone shifted. "There is one document we need to review," he said lightly. "Just a formality." The woman in scrubs began handing out papers. I recognized them instantly. Updated waivers. Thicker than the last ones. More clauses. More language about unforeseeable events. About acceptance of inherent risk. About arbitration. One by one, pens were lifted. Helen didn't move. Her gaze flicked to me, then back to Ellison. "What happens if we don't sign?" she asked. The room went quiet. Ellison's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes hardened. We'd hate for anyone to feel uncomfortable, but without updated documentation, we can't guarantee move-in priority. And Luke Fallow is but that priority. The man with white knuckles spoke up. "I sold my house." Ellison nodded sympathetically. "And we want to honor that commitment. This paperwork allows us to proceed." I stepped forward before I'd fully decided to. "Mark," I said. Every head turned. He blinked, just once. "Daniel, this is a private session. Then you shouldn't be presenting safety assurances without a state representative present?" I replied evenly. Murmurs rippled through the room. Ellison's jaw tightened. "We're well within our rights." "Maybe," I said. "But you're asking residents to sign off on risks tied to systems still under review." He stared at me for a long second, then smiled again. "I think this meeting is over." The woman in scrubs began collecting the papers, her movements quick and practiced. Helen stood slowly. "You said this place was safe." Ellison met her gaze. "I said it was as safe as any building can be." That was when it happened. A sharp crack echoed through the hall, followed by a low groan of metal shifting. The lights flickered. Once, twice. Someone screamed. The emergency lights failed to engage. For a heartbeat, the room froze in darkness. Then backup power kicked in, casting everything in a dim, uneven glow. I moved without thinking. "Stay seated," I shouted. "Don't panic." The smell hit me next. Electrical, hot, wrong. A woman near the aisle clutched her chest, breathing fast. The man with white knuckles slumped forward, eyes rolling back. "Call 911, someone yelled. Ellison stood rigid at the front of the room, his tablet clattering to the floor. I ran for the nearest exit. The door didn't open. Not locked. Reinforced. I slammed my shoulder into it once, twice, until it gave with a screech of torn metal. Cold air rushed in. "Move!" I shouted, guiding residents toward the opening, counting heads, watching for falls, for confusion. Sirens wailed in the distance as sprinklers finally engaged in another wing, water pounding somewhere out of sight. By the time firefighters arrived, the immediate danger had passed. No fire, no collapse, just a localized electrical failure. Officially, an accident. Unofficially, a warning shot. Outside, paramedics loaded the unconscious man into an ambulance. His wife sobbed softly, gripping his hand. Ellison approached me, his face pale now, smile gone. "This is exactly why we test systems," he said quietly. "To prevent worse outcomes." I looked at him, really looked at him, and understood something with a clarity that made my hands shake. This wasn't negligence. It was calibration. They were finding the breaking point, measuring how much failure could be absorbed without triggering oversight, how close they could walk people to the edge and still call it acceptable. Helen stood beside me, wrapped in a blanket, eyes fixed on the flashing lights. "They told us it was ready," she whispered. I watched firefighters coil hoses, watched inspectors I'd worked with for years take notes, already shaping this into something manageable. In that moment, sirens fading, water dripping from the building's skin, I felt the ground shift beneath every belief I'd held about my job. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with a citation. It was a system that required someone to decide whose risk mattered. And whether I liked it or not, that decision had just landed squarely on me. The official report came back clean. That was the first thing I read the next morning, sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold untouched. Localized electrical failure. No fire. No injuries requiring hospitalization. The man who'd collapsed was listed as a pre-existing cardiac event, likely unrelated. Likely? I stared at that word until it lost meaning. I'd been on site when the lights went out. I'd smelled overheated wiring. I'd felt the door resist before it finally gave way. None of that showed up in the report. What did show up were tidy phrases, neutral language, the kind that smoothed sharp edges until nothing stuck out enough to demand attention. When you work inside a system long enough, you learn its vocabulary. You learn how truth gets translated into something palatable. I closed the report and opened the access logs again. This time, I didn't look at the events themselves. I looked at timing. Every after-hours test, every system check, every routine calibration, all of it clustered around one window between midnight and 3 a.m. The hours when no residents were present, when no inspectors were scheduled, when failure could be observed without consequence. Except the failure had slipped, just once. I printed the logs and slid them into a manila folder, the old-fashioned way. Paper leaves fewer trails than digital files. I'd learned that from colleagues who'd survived longer than they should have. At 10:22 a.m., I received an email marked confidential. It wasn't from my supervisor. It was from someone in procurement. "You didn't get this from me," the message read. "Check the supplier codes on your last inspection." Attached was a spreadsheet. I cross-referenced it against my notes, heart pounding harder with each match. Fire-resistant materials swapped for lower-grade alternatives. Emergency lighting, sourced from a distributor flagged in another state for falsified certifications. All technically approved under provisional waivers. All justifiable individually. Together, they painted a picture I didn't like. Cost savings disguised as efficiency. Risk diluted across so many small decisions it became invisible. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. This was the point where, in movies, the hero storms into someone's office and slams the evidence down. Where righteous anger forces accountability. That's not how it works. In real life, evidence has to be undeniable. It has to be ugly enough that no one can pretend it's just a misunderstanding. What I had was troubling. It wasn't damning. Not yet. At noon, my supervisor called me again. "This Sunridge situation," he said carefully, "has people nervous." "People should be nervous," I replied. Silence stretched between us. "You need to step back," he said finally. "Let the review process do its job." "I am the review process." "You're part of it," he corrected. "Not the whole." After the call, I sat there longer than I should have, listening to the hum of the HVAC, watching dust drift through a shaft of sunlight. I thought about the man on the stretcher, about Helen wrapped in a blanket, about Ellison's calm voice as the lights failed. Calibration. That word stuck with me. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I visited the county records office in person. The building smelled like paper and disinfectant, a place frozen slightly behind the times. I requested zoning variances tied to Sunridge Haven, flipping through documents with a patience I didn't feel. That's when I saw it. A variance approved 2 years earlier for a different project. Same developer. Different name, different city, different outcome. The file was thin. Too thin. The project had been halted after a series of minor incidents. Electrical issues, evacuation drills that didn't go as planned. One resident hospitalized after a fall during a power fluctuation. No charges, no fines that stuck. The facility had reopened under new branding 6 months later. I photocopied everything. By the time I left the building, the sun was low, and my head throbbed with the dull ache that comes from too many connections clicking into place. Sunridge wasn't an experiment. It was a sequel. That night, I drove past the site again. No lights this time. No vans. Just the hulking outline of the building against the desert sky. I parked across the street, engine idling, and watched. At 1:11 a.m., the side entrance opened. One man stepped out, phone to his ear. He paced, gesturing sharply, then stopped and looked directly at my car. Even in the dark, I knew he saw me. My phone buzzed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." No number, no signature. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove home and sat at my kitchen table until dawn, spreading documents out like a map. Logs, variances, supplier codes, timelines. It still wasn't enough. I needed something that couldn't be explained away, something that connected intent to outcome. I got it 3 days later. The email came from the same anonymous address as before. This time, there was no message, just a video file. I hesitated before opening it, finger hovering over the trackpad. Some part of me knew that once I watched it, there would be no unseeing it. The footage was grainy, time-stamped 12:48 a.m. It showed a maintenance corridor at Sunridge Haven. 2 men stood at an open control panel. One adjusted a breaker, the other held a clipboard. "Not too much," a voice said. "We need to know how long before backup kicks in. And if it doesn't," the other asked. A pause. "Then we know we went too far." See. I closed the laptop, heart hammering in my ears. They weren't fixing problems. They were creating them. Still, even that wasn't enough on its own. No faces, no names, no explicit orders, just implication. In the eyes of the law, implication is smoke. It suggests fire without proving it. I gathered everything into the folder and locked it in the trunk of my car. For the first time since this began, I felt the weight of isolation press down on me. I was standing at the edge of something that couldn't be resolved cleanly, not without collateral damage, not without consequences that would ripple outward, touching people who had already given up more than they should have. The system wanted this to stay small, contained, manageable. I understood then that the question wasn't whether I could expose what was happening. It was whether I was willing to live with what exposure would destroy. And that realization, that heavy, suffocating certainty, was the first real proof that this wasn't just about a building anymore. It was about choosing which kind of wrong I could tolerate. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in, slow and deliberate, like heat through concrete. The kind you don't notice until you realize you've been sweating for hours. The first thing to go was access. On Monday morning, I logged into the internal inspection system and found half my permissions grayed out. Files I'd reviewed for years now required secondary authorization. When I called IT, they told me it was part of a routine security update. When I asked who approved it, they said they couldn't see that information. My supervisor stopped answering emails. Not refusing, not pushing back, just silence. At work, conversations ended when I walked into a room. People who'd shared coffee with me for years suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else. It wasn't hostility, it was fear. Fear is quieter than anger, and much more contagious. By Wednesday, I was officially reassigned. Not suspended, not disciplined. Special projects, the memo said. Translation, sidelined without cause. I was given a temporary desk near the back of the office, far from windows, far from anyone who mattered. No inspections, no site visits. Just document review and training modules I'd completed a decade earlier. They weren't punishing me. They were waiting me out. That afternoon, I noticed the dark sedan again. Same distance, same behavior. It followed me from the office to the grocery store, lingered at the edge of the parking lot while I bought milk and bread, then peeled off when I pulled back onto the road. I didn't speed up. I didn't slow down. I just watched. That night, my daughter called. Her voice was tight, controlled in the way it gets when she's trying not to scare herself. "Dad," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Okay. Did you piss someone off?" I closed my eyes. "What happened?" I asked. "Someone emailed my department chair," she said. "Anonymous. Said you were under investigation. That your work was questionable." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "They didn't accuse you of anything specific," she continued. "Just enough to make people curious. Did your chair believe it?" "No," she said quickly. Then, softer, "But now it's in the air." That was the point. They weren't trying to destroy me outright. They were poisoning the space around me, making me radioactive enough that people stepped back on their own. I told my daughter it would be fine, that these things blow over. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room, phone still in my hand, and admitted something I'd been avoiding. This wasn't professional anymore. They'd crossed the line from containment to deterrence. The next morning, I found my car door unlocked. Nothing was missing. No damage, no note, just the quiet knowledge that someone had been inside. I checked the glove compartment. Empty. The trunk closed. When I started the engine, the dashboard lit up normally. No warning lights, no obvious sabotage. It would have been easier if they'd done something overt. Slashed tires, broken windows, clear hostility. Instead, they were reminding me how exposed I was. That afternoon, I drove to Helen's temporary apartment complex, a low-rise building near a strip mall, beige and forgettable. The kind of place designed to be passed through, not lived in. She answered the door slowly, relief flickering across her face when she saw me. "They told us not to talk to you," she said quietly, letting me in. "Who did?" "The management. They said it could complicate things." Her living room was small but neat. Cardboard boxes stacked against one wall. Everything she owned reduced to a few labeled containers, ready to be moved again at a moment's notice. "They're accelerating the move-in," she said, pushing people to sign. "Are you going to?" I asked. She looked at her hands. "Where else would we go?" That was the leverage. Not threats, not force, scarcity. I left her apartment with the sickening awareness that every day I hesitated, someone else paid for it. On Friday, the call came. Not anonymous this time. Ellison. "Daniel," he said, his tone friendly, almost concerned. "I hear you've been reassigned." "Temporary," I replied. "Of course. Still, I wanted to check in. Make sure there are no hard feelings." "There aren't," I said, and meant it in the narrowest sense possible. He chuckled softly. "Good. I'd hate for misunderstandings to affect people who don't deserve it." "Like who?" "Like your daughter," he said, without hesitation. Silence stretched between us. "You looked her up," I said. "I did," he replied calmly. "Public information. Impressive program." My jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," he said. "Stability, predictability, no surprises. I don't make those kinds of promises." "No," he agreed. "You make reports." The implication hung there, heavy and unmistakable. When the call ended, I stood in my kitchen staring at the wall, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly loud enough to be irritating. I thought about how easy it would be to stop, to let the reassignment become permanent, to let someone else inherit this mess. No one would blame me. That was the cruel brilliance of it. The system offered me an exit at every turn, a clean conscience wrapped in plausible deniability. All I had to do was walk away. That night, I dreamed of corridors, endless hallways lit by flickering emergency lights, doors that wouldn't open, voices calling my name from behind walls I couldn't break through. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing, the echo of that calm whisper, "You were fair," still ringing in my ears. By morning, the decision I'd been circling crystallized into something sharp and unavoidable. If I stayed within the rules, I would lose. Not because the rules were wrong, but because they were incomplete, designed to manage failure after it happened, not prevent it when prevention required discomfort. They were counting on me to protect myself. Instead, I began planning how to make myself dangerous. Not loud, not dramatic, just inconvenient enough that ignoring me would cost more than silencing me. I backed up every file, printed every email, created duplicates stored in places I wouldn't forget but couldn't be easily traced. I stopped using my work phone for anything related to Sunridge. I drove different routes home, paid cash when I could, and I waited. Because people like Ellison didn't escalate unless they were certain they were losing control. And when they did, they always revealed something they couldn't take back. I intended to be there when that happened, even if standing there meant standing alone. I didn't expect the truth to arrive quietly. I'd been bracing for something explosive, a confession caught on tape, a paper trail too blatant to ignore, a mistake made out of arrogance. Instead, it came in the form of a request. Delivered so calmly, it took me a moment to understand what I was being asked. Helen called on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice sounded steadier than it had the last time we spoke. Not hopeful, resigned. "They're holding another meeting," she said. "For residents only. They said you could attend if you wanted." That alone was strange. "They changed their mind?" I asked. "No," she replied. "They changed their strategy." The meeting took place in the same conference suite, but the tone was different. No sales staff, no glossy slides, just chairs in a circle, like a support group. About 20 people showed up. Fewer family members this time. Ellison wasn't there. Instead, a man introduced himself as a legal consultant. Gray suit, thin smile. He spoke slowly, carefully, like someone used to delivering bad news without taking responsibility for it. "We want to be clear," he said. "Sunridge Haven meets all current regulatory standards. However, no building can be entirely risk-free." No one argued. They already knew that. "What we're offering," he continued, "is transparency and choice." He slid folders across the table. Not waivers this time. Disclosures. They outlined scenarios, power interruptions, evacuation delays, equipment failures. Each risk quantified, assigned a percentage, framed as statistically unlikely but possible. Then came the part that made my stomach drop. Attached to each disclosure was a pricing addendum. Reduced rates, locked-in fees, priority access to care services, in exchange for acknowledgement, not ignorance, not deception. Consent. An elderly man across from me adjusted his hearing aid. "So you're saying if something happens?" The consultant nodded. "You're saying you understand and accept that possibility." A woman near the window laughed softly. "At our age, that's already true." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I looked around at their faces. These weren't people being tricked. They were people being cornered. Housing options at their price point were scarce. Waiting lists stretched months, sometimes years. Many had already liquidated assets, downsized, given up independence for the promise of stability. Sunridge Haven wasn't perfect, but it was available. Helen raised her hand. "And if we don't sign?" The consultant's expression didn't change. "Then we refund your deposit and release your unit." Release. Another word that sounded neutral until you understood its weight. I felt something shift inside me then, something uncomfortable and necessary. This wasn't a simple case of exploitation. It was negotiation under duress. I stayed after the meeting, watching residents file out slowly, folders tucked under arms like medical charts. Some avoided my eyes. Others met my gaze with something close to defiance. Helen lingered. "They told us you'd try to stop this," she said quietly. "Some of us don't want that." I frowned. "You think this is acceptable?" She met my gaze evenly. "I think sleeping in my car isn't." That was the moment the ground tilted. All my careful moral lines, right and wrong, safe and unsafe, blurred at the edges. I'd been operating under the assumption that exposure would lead to protection, that shining a light on Sunridge would force accountability. But accountability doesn't build housing. It doesn't relocate people gently. It doesn't guarantee better outcomes when the alternative is nothing. "You should know," Helen continued. They told us if the project stalls, the financing collapses. Oh, did they say what happens then? She nodded once. The land gets sold. The units get converted. We start over somewhere else. Somewhere else. The phrase carried more uncertainty than fear. I drove home that night in silence, radio off, windows down despite the heat. The desert stretched out around me, endless and indifferent. I thought about the way Ellison had framed stability, about the legal consultant's calm voice, about how carefully this had all been constructed. They weren't hiding the risk anymore. They were monetizing it. Over the next week, I spoke to more residents. Not as an inspector, not officially, just as a man who listened. A former school librarian whose pension barely covered rent. A retired mechanic with early-stage Parkinson's. A woman who'd outlived 3 husbands and wasn't interested in starting over again. They knew the building wasn't perfect. They also knew the alternatives. One man said it plainly, "If I fall down the stairs here, at least someone will notice." That sentence followed me everywhere. I reviewed the disclosures again, this time not looking for loopholes but intent. The language was precise, cold, legally elegant, and horrifyingly honest. They weren't lying. That realization stripped me of the last clean justification I'd been holding on to. I couldn't frame this as good versus evil anymore. It was worse than that. It was harm management. I brought the documents to a friend of mine, retired now, used to work in regulatory law. We sat at his kitchen table, papers spread out between us. "They've covered themselves," he said, after a long silence. "Barely, but enough." "So what happens if I shut them down?" I asked. He sighed. "People get displaced. Lawsuits get filed. The project dies. Maybe another one takes its place in a few years. And if I don't? Then you live with this," he replied, tapping the folder. I went home with no answers, just a clearer understanding of the trap. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Risk had been transferred downward, diluted across the most vulnerable, justified through choice that wasn't really a choice at all. And I was standing at the intersection of enforcement and consequence, realizing that whatever I did next would cost someone something they couldn't afford to lose. For the first time since this began, I understood Ellison's confidence. He wasn't betting on my corruption. He was betting on my conscience. On the part of me that would hesitate once I saw the full picture. That would hesitate once the people I thought I was protecting asked me not to. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles above me, a single thought repeated itself with brutal clarity. Stopping Sunridge might be the right thing to do, but it might also be the cruelest. For most of my career, the line had been simple. Something met code, or it didn't. Something was safe, or it wasn't. If it failed, you shut it down. That clarity was the reason I'd stayed in this job when others burned out or sold out. The rules gave shape to decisions that would otherwise crush you. You didn't have to wonder whether you were hurting someone. The code told you. Sunridge broke that certainty. I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd lie awake listening to the ceiling fan hum, replaying the same question over and over, turning it like a loose tooth. I couldn't stop touching. If I shut them down, who pays the price? The answer wasn't abstract anymore. It had names, faces, hands that shook when they signed papers they barely understood but felt forced to accept. I tried to approach it clinically. Made lists, pros and cons, consequences mapped out like inspection reports. Option 1, escalate formally. Trigger a full investigation. Freeze the project. Outcome, Sunridge stalls. Financing pulls out. Residents displaced. No immediate alternative housing. Developer likely walks away with minimal loss. Option 2, walk away. Let the system absorb it. Outcome, Sunridge opens. Risk remains. Failure eventually happens on someone else's watch. I keep my job. I live with it. Both options felt wrong. That was the worst part. Not choosing between right and wrong, but between wrong and wrong. One afternoon, I drove to the edge of the city where the desert gives up and the sprawl takes over. I parked near an unfinished development, rows of identical frames, abandoned, mid-build, wood, bleached gray by the sun. A project that had failed its financing and never recovered. I walked between the skeletons, stepping over discarded nails and warped planks, imagining what Sunridge would look like if it ended up the same way. Just another cautionary tale swallowed by the sand. Would that be better? I thought about Helen's apartment, boxes stacked like she was always ready to be moved again. About the man who'd said falling down the stairs here at least meant someone would notice. Safety, I realized, wasn't a switch. It wasn't on or off. It was a gradient. And so, that realization scared me more than any threat Ellison had made, because gradients invite judgment, and judgment is messy, personal, impossible to hide behind. I called my daughter that night, not to warn her, not to explain everything, just to hear her voice. "How's school?" I asked. She laughed softly. "Still brutal, still worth it." I hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever think about what you'd compromise on if it meant helping people right now instead of maybe helping them later?" She was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like a trap." "Yeah," I said. "It is." "What the body?" "I think," she said slowly, "that doing nothing is still a choice. People just pretend it isn't." After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, that sentence echoing in my head. Doing nothing is still a choice. Ellison called the next day. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You've been talking to residents," he said. "They reached out to me." "They're confused," he replied. "They don't need mixed messages." "Then stop putting them in impossible positions." A pause. Then, "This is bigger than you, Daniel." "I know." "Then act like it." I almost laughed at that. Act like it. As if recognizing scale somehow relieved responsibility instead of amplifying it. After the call, I pulled out the folder I'd been avoiding. The video, the logs, the disclosures. All the proof that something was wrong, paired with the equally undeniable proof that exposing it wouldn't fix everything. I spread the papers across my kitchen table and sat down, palms flat against the wood. This was the moment people imagine when they talk about moral courage, the crossroads, the dramatic choice. The truth was uglier. There was no clean path forward, no outcome where I walked away intact and everyone else was better off. I thought about the man who collapsed during the outage, about how close that moment had come to being something worse. I thought about the midnight tests, the calibration, the way failure was being measured and priced. They were pushing the system until it bent. If it snapped, someone would die. That much I was certain of. The question wasn't whether harm would occur. It was when and how much, and to whom. I realized then that I'd been framing the problem incorrectly. I wasn't choosing between enforcement and mercy. I was choosing between exposure and intervention. Exposure would feel righteous. It would satisfy the part of me that wanted truth on the record, consequences assigned, names attached. It would also unleash forces I couldn't control. Intervention would be quieter, risky in a different way. It would require stepping outside the narrow lane my job allowed, and into a space where intent mattered more than procedure. It would mean bending rules instead of enforcing them. That thought made my chest tighten. I'd spent decades defining myself by adherence, by being the person who didn't bend. But the more I stared at the evidence, the clearer it became. Ellison had already bent the system, twisted it just enough to stay legal while shifting danger downward. Playing by the rules now didn't restore balance. It preserved the tilt. I stood up and walked to the window, watching headlights move along the street like slow insects. Normal lives, normal evenings. People trusting that the places they slept, the buildings they moved into, had been vetted by someone who cared. By someone like me. I knew then that if I did this the right way, I'd be complicit in the wrong outcome. And if I did it the wrong way, I might actually reduce harm. That was the moment my sense of identity cracked. I wasn't deciding what was legal anymore. I was deciding what I could live with. The next morning, I went back to Sunridge Haven, not unannounced, not confrontational. I asked for a meeting. Ellison agreed immediately. We sat in a finished office, overlooking the site. Workers moved below us, ants in reflective vests, unaware of how close their labor was to becoming a symbol instead of a shelter. "I know what you're doing," I said without preamble. Ellison leaned back, studying me. "Then you know why it's necessary. You're measuring failure," I said, "not preventing it. That's how improvement works." End quote. At whose expense? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady. At the expense of a hypothetical future we can't afford. I took a breath. There's another way. His eyebrow lifted slightly. I'm listening. I outlined it carefully. Incremental changes. System upgrades phased in under existing provisional allowances. Enhanced redundancy framed as efficiency improvements. Temporary delays justified by documentation reviews rather than safety violations. Not exposure. Correction. Ellison watched me with something like surprise. You're suggesting I spend more money, he said. I'm suggesting you spend it now, I replied. Or far more later. And you? He asked. What do you get? I met his gaze. People stay alive. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ellison smiled, not warmly this time, but with something like respect. You know this costs you, he said. I know. I left the meeting with no guarantees, no written agreement, just a shared understanding that something had shifted. I was no longer trying to stop Sunridge. I was trying to make it safer than it was ever meant to be. And I knew, with a clarity that settled deep in my bones, that whatever happened next, I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Not into corruption, but into responsibility that didn't come with protection. The kind you carry alone. I didn't file a complaint after that meeting. I didn't escalate. I didn't call the press. I didn't walk into my supervisor's office with a righteous speech and a stack of documents that would force his hand. All of that would have felt cleaner, more recognizable, the kind of action people applauded after the fact. Instead, I did something quieter. I started using the system the way Ellison had, only in reverse. The first move was paperwork. I requested a series of routine clarifications on Sunridge's provisional approvals. Nothing alarming, just follow-ups. Questions about redundancy thresholds, load tolerances, documentation alignment between vendors and engineering sign-offs. Each request, on its own, was harmless. Together, they slowed everything. Deliveries got rescheduled, subcontractors waited on confirmations, meetings multiplied, the timeline stretched. Not enough to spook investors, but enough to create friction. Ellison noticed immediately. He called me 2 days later, his tone carefully neutral. You're adding complexity. I'm adding documentation, I replied. Complexity is already there. He exhaled through his nose. This isn't what we discussed. It is, I said. Just not the version that gets you sued. That was the balance I had to strike. Apply pressure without triggering collapse. Force upgrades without exposing intent. I worked late nights, cross-referencing codes most inspectors barely glanced at, found gray areas, transitional allowances, language that allowed for enhancements under the banner of optimization rather than correction. Backup generators were upgraded under a new efficiency standard. Emergency lighting circuits were rerouted under load balancing. Fire exit hardware was replaced under an accessibility improvement. Each change made the building safer. Each change cost money, and each one had my name on the paperwork. I knew what that meant. If anyone audited this later, really audited it, they'd see a pattern. An inspector who'd gone beyond enforcement into influence. Someone who'd shaped outcomes rather than recorded them. I was lacing my fingerprints through the project. The second move was people. I stopped avoiding the ones who'd gone quiet around me. Instead, I asked for their help, carefully, casually, over coffee, in hallways, not to blow the whistle, not to take sides, just to double-check numbers, to review language, to ask, does this make sense to you? Most of them didn't want to know, but a few did. A fire safety analyst stayed late to walk me through alternative configurations that technically exceeded requirements without triggering reapproval. A procurement officer flagged vendors who could deliver higher-grade materials without rewriting contracts. No one said we were fixing a problem. We said we were improving performance. That distinction mattered. Ellison pushed back when costs spiked. We're drifting, he said during one call. This wasn't the agreement. This was always the agreement, I replied. Reduce risk. He paused. You're redefining risk. No, I said. I'm narrowing it. There was a long silence after that. I thought he might pull the plug, expose me, take the loss, and move on. He didn't, because even with the added costs, Sunridge was still profitable. still viable, still cheaper than starting over somewhere else. He'd built his model to absorb a certain amount of friction. I was making sure it absorbed the right kind. The third move was the hardest. I went back to the residents, not as an authority figure, not as a savior, as someone honest enough to say, I can't fix everything, but I'm trying to fix what I can. I didn't promise safety. I promised attention. Helen listened quietly as I explained what was changing. Backup systems, exit access, monitoring protocols. You're not shutting it down, she said. No. She studied my face. Why? I answered truthfully. Because shutting it down would hurt you more than it would hurt them. She nodded slowly. Then do what you're doing. Some residents were angry. They wanted the truth out. They wanted accountability. Others just wanted stability. I learned then that victims don't all want justice the same way. Some want names, some want apologies, some just want the lights to stay on. Over time, the building changed. Not visibly, not in ways marketing could photograph, but in the bones of it. Redundancy where there had been none, time buffers where there had been pressure. Systems designed to fail less catastrophically when failure eventually came. It wasn't perfect, but it was better, and every improvement made me more vulnerable. My supervisor finally called me in late one afternoon. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he slid a file across the desk. Your involvement in Sunridge? He said. Explain it. I told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I saw risk being managed in ways that left people exposed, I said. So I managed it differently. He leaned back, eyes heavy. That's not your role. Maybe not, I replied, but it was my responsibility. He closed the file. You're blurring lines. I know. You're opening us up. I know. Another pause. Then, quietly, are people safer? Yes, I said. Without hesitation, he nodded once. That's not a defense. No, I agreed. It's a fact. I left his office knowing I'd burned something I couldn't rebuild. Trust. Plausible deniability. The illusion that my hands were clean. But I also knew this. If something went wrong at Sunridge now, fewer people would die. That wasn't justice. It was triage. The calls from Ellison slowed, then stopped. Construction resumed its rhythm. Move-in dates were announced. Deposits converted. Lives transitioned. From the outside, it looked like a success. From the inside, it felt like walking a wire stretched between two buildings that hated each other. Every morning, I expected the call that would end it. The audit, the investigation, the article that would ask why a mid-level inspector had so much influence over a private project. It never came. Instead, something else did. A message slipped under my office door. We know what you did. So do they. Be careful. No signature. No threat. Just acknowledgement. I sat at my desk, the note folded between my fingers, and felt a strange, unwelcome calm settle over me. This was the cost. Not punishment, not absolution. Visibility. I'd stepped into a space where my actions mattered enough to be noticed, but not enough to be protected. The kind of space where you don't get medals or indictments, just consequences that unfold slowly, quietly, over time. I didn't tell myself I'd done the right thing. I told myself I'd done the least wrong thing available. And some days, that had to be enough. Ellison waited longer than I expected before making his next move. That was his mistake. People like him were used to leverage that, worked immediately. Money, access, fear. Silence was a different weapon, one that required patience and confidence. He had confidence. He lacked patience. The call came on a Thursday evening, just after sunset, when Phoenix cooled enough that the heat stopped pressing against the windows. I was standing in my kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug I hadn't used, when my phone vibrated against the counter. His name lit up the screen. Daniel, he said without greeting. We need to talk. We've been talking, I replied. Not like this. I dried my hands slowly. Then say what you mean. A pause. I could hear traffic in the background on his end, the low hiss of tires on asphalt. He was driving. That meant this mattered. You're changing the project beyond what we agreed, he said. Costs are climbing. Timelines are drifting. People are safer. I said. That's not the only metric, he snapped, the calm slipping just enough to reveal irritation. I leaned against the counter. It's the only one I care about. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. That's exactly the problem. We agreed to meet the next morning. His office sat on the top floor of a downtown building that smelled like polished stone and money. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a controlled environment. From up there, everything looked orderly, manageable. Ellison gestured for me to sit, then remained standing, hands braced on the back of his chair. You've made yourself indispensable, he said. Do you know how rare that is? That wasn't my goal. No, he agreed, but it's impressive. You understand the system better than most people who benefit from it. I waited. You've also put yourself in a very uncomfortable position, he continued. You've bent procedures, influenced outcomes, left a trail. Everything I've done is documented, I replied. Of course it is, he said smoothly. That's what makes it dangerous. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of my requests, my notes, my approvals, annotated. You see, Ellison said, finally sitting down, if anyone asks why Sunridge deviated from standard timelines, your name comes up again and again. That's because I was involved. Yes, he said, and involvement implies responsibility. I closed the folder. What do you want? To reset, he said. Return to baseline. You step back. Let us handle the rest. And if I don't, his gaze hardened. Then we have a problem. There it was. Not a threat. A statement of fact. You could expose everything, he continued. Force an investigation. Burn the project down. I could, I said. And what happens then? He asked. Residents displaced. Lawsuits drag on for years. The building sits empty. Investors move on. You get your moment of moral clarity. Everyone else gets consequences. He leaned forward. Is that the outcome you want attached to your name? I felt the familiar pull of anger, sharp and tempting. The urge to push back, to call his bluff. Instead, I asked a different question. What happens if something goes wrong now? Ellison's eyes flicked to the window, then back to me. You mean hypothetically? I mean realistically. He considered this, choosing his words. We manage it. You can't manage a dead resident, I said quietly. The silence that followed stretched longer than either of us seemed comfortable with. You're not wrong, he said finally. But you're not entitled to decide how risk is distributed. I already did, I replied. So did you. That was when his expression changed. Not anger, not fear, calculation. You think you're controlling this, he said. You're not. You're balancing on a knife edge. One audit, one inquiry, and your entire career becomes a case study in overreach. I'm aware, and you're still doing it, he said. Why? I met his gaze. Because the alternative is pretending neutrality is harmless. Ellison smiled then, not pleasantly, with something like reluctant admiration. You know, he said, most people in your position would have taken a payoff or walked away. I did neither. That's what worries me. He stood, signaling the meeting was over. I'll be clear, he said. If you keep pushing, I'll protect my interests. I expect nothing less, I replied. As I left the building, I felt the full weight of what he'd said settle into my bones. This was the escalation, not violence, not exposure, alignment. Ellison wasn't trying to crush me. He was trying to absorb me, to make me part of the mechanism, willingly or not, to blur the line until there was no clean place left to stand. The following weeks were tense. My supervisor called me in twice, each time more formal than the last. Questions sharpened, language tightened. I was asked to justify decisions I'd already explained, to walk through processes step by step, as if repetition might reveal guilt. At home, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked down the block. Not always the same, not always obvious. At work, my reassignment became permanent. Until further notice, the memo read. Sunridge Haven moved forward. Residents began moving in. I drove past the building one evening and saw lights glowing warmly through the windows. People inside, living, settling. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like standing beneath a storm cloud that hadn't decided where to break. The breaking came sooner than I expected. A minor incident. That's how it was described. A generator failed during a heat advisory. Backup engaged late. No one died. 2 residents treated for dehydration. 1 hospitalized overnight. Ellison called me within the hour. "This is exactly what I warned you about," he said. "Your fingerprints are all over this." "And they're alive," I replied. "For now," he snapped. "The inquiry is coming." I closed my eyes. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The justification. The opening to draw a hard line and force a resolution. "They'll ask why the backup engaged late," he continued. "They'll look at the modifications, at your approvals." "Let them," I said. "You're gambling," he said. "With your future." "No," I replied. "With yours." There was a pause. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," I said evenly, "that if this becomes public, the narrative won't be about one inspector overstepping. It'll be about a developer who needed someone inside the system to make his building survivable." Silence. "You won't do that," he said finally. "I don't want to," I replied. "But I will if you force me." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, cold. "You think this gives you leverage? It gives us a shared problem," I said. "One we can either manage responsibly or detonate." The line went dead. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room, lights off, listening to the city breathe. I thought about how far I'd drifted from the person who'd believed the code was enough, how entangled I'd become in outcomes instead of procedures. Ellison had been right about one thing. I was no longer neutral. But neutrality, I realized, had never been as clean as I'd pretended. It just hid its costs better. By morning, I knew the inquiry would come. The audit. The reckoning. The only question left was who would blink first and what they'd be willing to sacrifice to survive it. The inquiry arrived quietly. No press, no subpoenas, just an email marked formal review notice sitting in my inbox at 7:04 a.m. Written in language so neutral it felt anesthetic. A compliance audit. Scope to be determined. Cooperation expected. I read it twice, then closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, hands folded on the kitchen table, watching the sunlight creep across the floor. This was it. Not the explosion people imagine when they think of consequences. Just a process. Slow, methodical, designed to turn decisions into timelines and intentions into footnotes. At the office, no one looked at me directly. The review team set up in a conference room on the 3rd floor. 2 auditors from the state, 1 external consultant. All polite, all careful. They asked me to walk them through Sunridge Haven from the beginning. I told them the truth, not the heroic version. Not the version where I'd saved the day or outsmarted a villain. I told them I'd seen risk. I told them I'd known the system would move too slowly to protect people in time. I told them I'd chosen intervention over exposure. They took notes. They asked about my authority, about precedent, about why I hadn't escalated sooner. I answered each question calmly, aware that every sentence was being weighed not for morality, but for liability. Ellison testified the next day. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. I could imagine it easily enough. His controlled tone, his carefully framed concern for residents, his emphasis on compliance, on how my involvement had created confusion and cost overruns. He didn't deny the risks. He reframed them. Sunridge, he said, had always been transparent. The residents had consented. The modifications had been unnecessary, driven by an inspector who'd lost objectivity. And here was the twist I hadn't anticipated. The residents backed him up. Not all of them. Not loudly, but enough. Helen submitted a statement. She wrote that she understood the risks, that she appreciated the improvements, but that she hadn't wanted the project delayed or threatened. That stability had mattered more to her than procedural purity. Others echoed her sentiment. They didn't defend Ellison out of loyalty. They defended the outcome. Reading those statements felt like having the ground give way beneath me. I'd believed naively. It turned out that if things came to light, the people affected would rally around the truth. But the truth wasn't what they wanted protected. It was their lives as they were now. Sunridge Haven was open, functioning, safer than it had been. Not perfect, but livable. Exposing the process that got them there would destabilize that. So they chose silence. Not because they were coerced, because they were pragmatic. The review dragged on for weeks. During that time, I was placed on administrative leave, paid, indefinite, a polite purgatory. I wasn't accused of misconduct. I wasn't cleared, either. Every morning, I walked past my badge sitting on the kitchen counter and felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the identity I was losing, relief that I no longer had to pretend the system was enough. One afternoon, my supervisor came to my house. He didn't sit. "They're not going to touch Ellison," he said bluntly. "Too clean, too much consent, too much risk spread out to pin down." "And me?" I asked. He hesitated. "They need a boundary." I nodded. I'd known that. The system couldn't admit that bending rules had reduced harm. That would invite chaos. It needed to reinforce the idea that procedure was the only legitimate path, even when procedure failed. "So what happens?" I asked. "You're reassigned," he said. "Out of inspection, into policy review. No field authority." It was a demotion without the word. My name would stay clean, my record intact, but my leverage gone. "Sunridge?" I asked. "Continues," he replied, "with monitoring." I leaned back against the counter, feeling the dull thud of something settling into place. In the end, no one went to jail, no one was publicly shamed, no expose ran in the paper, and no one died. That was the trade. Ellison got to keep his project. The residents got to keep their homes. The system got to keep its narrative. And I got to carry the cost. A week later, I drove past Sunridge Haven one last time. The parking lot was half full. A woman sat on a bench near the entrance, reading in the shade. A nurse helped a man into a car, moving carefully, deliberately. The building stood solid against the heat. I realized then that the twist wasn't that the villain won or that justice failed. It was that the people I'd been trying to protect had chosen an outcome that required my quiet removal. They didn't betray me. They outgrew the version of protection I'd imagined for them. The hardest truth wasn't that the system punished me. It was that, in this case, the system had adjusted and I no longer fit inside it. I drove away knowing something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. I hadn't lost, but I hadn't won either. I'd done something far more dangerous. I'd proven that harm could be reduced without punishment, and that truth was too destabilizing to be allowed to stand. That was the real line I'd crossed, and there was no appeal for that. I don't wear the jacket anymore. The navy windbreaker with the state patch still hangs in my closet, pressed and clean, like a uniform waiting for a body that won't return. Some mornings I catch myself reaching for it out of habit, muscle memory overriding reality, and then I stop, hand hovering in the air, and let it fall. Old reflexes die slowly. My new office is on the 4th floor of a building no one visits unless they have to. Policy review, long-term standards, future-facing language. I sit at a desk with no windows and write recommendations that may or may not ever be implemented. The work is quiet, abstract, safe. No one calls me in the middle of the night anymore. No one follows my car. No one asks what kind of person I am. On paper, this looks like a resolution. I kept my pension. My record is clean. My name is intact. When people from the department talk about Sunridge Haven now, they do it in the past tense, as if it were a completed chapter instead of an ongoing compromise. I let them, because the truth is harder to explain than silence. Sunridge is still there. I know because I drive past it sometimes, not often, usually without planning to. I'll be running errands or taking a longer route home, and there it is, rising out of the desert like it always did. Neutral, modern, unremarkable. At night, the lights are on. That's what I notice most. Rows of warm squares against the dark, steady and calm, like a promise being kept just well enough to avoid scrutiny. Sometimes I park across the street and sit with the engine off, windows down, listening. I hear laughter once in a while. A television, the low murmur of people living their lives. No sirens, no alarms, no names added to reports. That's the metric no one tracks. Helen still lives there. She sent me a card not long after my reassignment became official. A plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a simple note written in careful handwriting. We're okay. Thank you for seeing us. No apology, no explanation, just that. I keep it in the drawer of my desk, beneath policy drafts and procedural memos, where it doesn't belong but stays anyway. Some nights, I wonder if I should feel angry at Ellison for building something that needed to be negotiated into safety, at the system for protecting itself instead of the people inside it, at myself for stepping outside my role and then accepting the cost when it snapped back. But anger would require certainty, and certainty is the one thing this story never gave me. Instead, I feel something quieter, heavier, responsibility without recognition. There's no language for that in official reports. People like stories with heroes and villains, clean arcs and earned endings. This wasn't that kind of story. There was no moment where everything broke open and truth flooded the room. No final confrontation where the right person fell. Just a series of decisions made under pressure, each one shaving off a little clarity in exchange for immediate relief. When my daughter asks about work now, I tell her it's fine, boring, even. She believes me. She has her own battles, her own compromises, and I don't want to add mine to the pile. Sometimes, though, she asks a different question. Do you miss it? She'll say. I never answer right away. What I miss isn't the authority, or the badge, or the certainty I used to pretend the code provided. I miss knowing exactly where I stood, because now I live in the gray. I know that fewer people were hurt because I bent rules instead of enforcing them. I also know that in doing so, I made it easier for people like Ellison to argue that outcomes justify methods. I closed one door. I opened another. Whether that trade was worth it depends entirely on who's asking. Every so often, a new policy draft crosses my desk. Proposed updates to safety standards. Language about proactive risk mitigation. Redundancy thresholds, informed by recent case studies. I recognize my fingerprints in the phrasing. No one credits me. No one ever will. And that's the point. The system can absorb lessons. It just can't acknowledge the people who taught them by breaking form. On my way home one evening, I stopped at a light near Sunridge Haven. The sun was setting, the sky bleeding orange into purple, heat radiating off the asphalt. A shuttle bus pulled out of the driveway, slow and careful, heading toward the main road. I watched it disappear into traffic. I don't know if what I did was right. I know it wasn't clean. I know that if I'd followed the book, I'd still be wearing that jacket, still signing off on inspections, still believing that procedure equals protection. But I also know this. If I had done everything by the book, someone would have been carried out of that building in a body bag by now. That's not a victory. It's not justice. It's just a fact. And it's the one I live with. Every light still on at night. Every report that never had to be written. Every ending that didn't make headlines because it never happened. I didn't save anyone. I just made it harder for the worst thing to occur. In a system built to react after the damage is done, that's the closest thing to mercy I know how to offer. And no one is going to thank me for it. That's fine. Some prices aren't meant to be reimbursed. They're just meant to be paid quietly, over time, by the person who chose not to look away.